Hey students, it's Mr. T. If you look here, I've got my little image up here in the corner, which I'm gonna move around like this. No. I just wanted to touch base with you guys and give you a little glimpse of the slideshow that I posted it was supposed to be the last lecture of the Unit 7 before going into Unit 8, which you should have picked up. I just want to run through a couple of these things. It's on post-war recovery, so we're not going to look at these too deeply, but what I do want to show you for sure is that this whole Marshall Plan concept here, the $12 billion for the recovery of Europe, that's really going to be the key here in understanding what the post-war situation is like and how the United States helps to rebuild Europe and also the reasons why they do that. This picture right here, that's the one of the few buildings that was left standing in Hiroshima. You can see a couple other ones in the background. But that building in Hiroshima was right under the blast site. And I show you this picture because I want you to see the the impact of the damage that was done by the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And Nagasaki was the same way. Just a lot of damage that not just infrastructure, but also economically, and then the human cost as well. So it's important to remember that. So here's what I want to show you on the European recovery. And so here, once again, you have a couple of things to consider. First of all, this point here, the U.S. was a reservoir of resources. So this number, 50% of world production, the U.S. accounted for by the end of World War II, just an astronomical percentage, and that had to do with the wartime economy, just the American military and economic machine that was fully tapped into during the war. And the end result of that, what usually happens is because of wartime production, you overproduce. And so when a war is over, normally a nation will go into recession or will see a pullback in the economy after war. It usually happens. But what's going to help is the Marshall Plan here, which was passed in 1948. And it was a plan to rebuild and stabilize Europe. So there's really two key points: the rebuilding of Europe to rebuild infrastructure, industries, and things like that, but also to stabilize Europe, to stabilize the economies. So it gives this $12 billion plus dollar number, and different sources will give you different numbers, but it's pretty close to 12 billion. The stabilization, though, I mentioned was really important because of this point right down here. The intention was to try to prevent the spread of communism throughout Europe. And you'll notice if you look over here at the map, these dollar stacks of dollar signs, are representative of the amount of aid that was given to each country. And so the countries that had the most aid given to them were the UK and France. And you'll also notice, too, that if you could draw a line other than Turkey, and you'll notice that all of the nations that get aid are to the west of that line. And that's because what ends up happening after World War II is the economies, the nations of the East fall under what's called the Iron Curtain, which you will see more about in the Unit 8 stuff about communism and the Cold War and things like that. The next couple slides are intended to look at the European recovery and then also the Japanese recovery. And so what you really begin to see is an integration of economies in Europe. So this point here about integration, then you see a couple of examples here. And this covers the rest of the 20th century. And it's, again, this idea of integration of economies. This is kind of the way that Europe was able to stabilize itself. And this whole European Union concept has been a really big deal the last few years because of Brexit. where the UK actually left or is leaving the European Union. So that's one key point. But then also another aspect of cooperation is the creation of the United Nations. I mean, it wasn't just something that affected Europe, but it was particularly important for Europe. It was basically building on what they tried to do with the League of Nations, but it had a different context and a different purpose. It was much more inclusive, and it was a lot more stable. It covered a far greater amount of issues, covered a much greater amount of areas of concern and need than the League of Nations did. So that was really important. And then as far as Japan, what's really interesting about Japan is that you see a stabilization and recovery because the U.S. actually occupied Japan for the first 7.5 years following World War II. And so it was under the leadership of Douglas MacArthur, who was a general, a really famous general during World War II, and he's actually really famous during the Korean War as well, but for different reasons. So the key here for Japan is not just the U.S. occupation and how, especially in this third point here, the U.S. rebuilds Japan's political and economic infrastructure. It's these two terms, democratization and demilitarization. And so what we do is we basically build Japan's political system to have strong democratic controls and strong checks on power so that the militarization, the rise of military leaders can't happen to the same degree anymore. And the demilitarization aspect is we actually prevented Japan from having a military, and we actually became the sole provider of Japanese defense for a time, which was really interesting. But the U.S. involvement is responsible for this point down here about the Japanese growth for about 2 decades. It was just remarkable to the point where now it's a little bit different now, but for basically the second half of the 20th century, Japan eventually became the second largest economy in the world after the United States. And then this here, which if you didn't realize from the slide regarding Europe and the Marshall Plan, part of the reason we do this is to provide stability so that we can have an anti-communist ally. What you really see is, as the communist world develops, is that the U.S. Fights for stability because what you tend to see is instability leading towards towards sort of communist sentiment. It's the instability that creates that drive. So stabilization was the U.S.'s way to prevent nations from falling to communism, and as such provided an ally, and especially with Japan being so close to the Soviet Union, was really important. So I wanted to include this here about the American post-war boom. Again, we mentioned that the U.S. dominated world economic output, having a lot to do with the explosion of the middle class. That's actually why the middle class is such a big talking point today among politicians. It's where you see the introduction of the GI Bill, which gets former soldiers back into the American social and economic life. You see labor union membership reach its peak in the mid-1950s. Just a lot of benefits, economic benefits for Americans. You really see probably the greatest period of American prosperity generally during the 20th century at this point, among other things. So Council of Economic Advisors was a bureau created to promote employment and profit and low inflation, things like that. And then you also have military spending, which of course coincides with the Cold War. But that just gives you a couple more details about the post-war boom. And that's it. I just wanted to catch up with you and give you kind of a run through about what was really significant about the post-war boom. I'll be back again another time with another video. See you later.